Responsive tables, huh?
Man, tell me about it.
If you've been doing front-end development for any amount of time, chances are you had to display some data in a table at some point. Tables are everywhere on the web. They're a really useful way to present data, but they're also really hard to display well on smaller screens. In this video, we'll go through a few strategies to design tables that work well on any screen size. Alright, we're going to use this table example, which looks great, but by design at the moment it doesn't work quite well on smaller screens. So let's see what happens when I reduce the width of the viewport. First, the columns squish together, but eventually they won't have enough space, and at this point the content starts disappearing behind the viewport. And at that point I can scroll to see the rest of the table, but as you can see, the entire page is now scrolling horizontally. If I open this menu, it makes it even clearer. Our entire document has now some horizontal scroll, which completely breaks the layout. Let's jump in the code and see how we can gradually improve the situation. We're using Next.js here, but that's completely irrelevant as we'll focus on the HTML markup and the CSS for our table. So we have a static list of users, and then for each user in our data, we're going to output a table row. Let's look at the first and quickest fix that we can bring just so that our table stops breaking our entire page layout. Okay, so the first very quick fix that we can apply, and that's a very low-hanging fruit, right at the top of our table markup in one of the wrapping divs here, I will add the class of overflow x auto. And this will essentially make the content scroll on the x-axis horizontally whenever there's not enough space to show it. And now our table content is still cropped behind the edge of the browser, but now when I scroll the table horizontally, only the table actually scrolls. So you can see the scroll bar down at the bottom. And so we don't have this problem anymore where we would break the entire page layout by adding some horizontal scroll. Nice. So let's make the viewport wider again, and let's look at some other approaches that we can use to make our content look better on smaller screens. Instead of simply making the content scroll horizontally when there's not enough space, what we're going to do now is decide to hide some of the table columns depending on the space available in our browser. So let's decide that the most important information on this table is the user name, their role, and the edit button. So perhaps we can hide the email address at smaller screens and maybe also hide the title. In our code, I'll find the table headings, and we'll start by hiding our title and our email headings. So for both these table headings, I will add a hidden class, and then in a second we'll bring back these table headings at larger screens. We've temporarily broken our table since we have removed two headings, so the role heading that should be here has now jumped 2 columns. Let's also hide the table cell in each table row for our title and email address data. I'll scroll down to find the table rows, and these are the 2 table cells that we want to remove. So once again, I will add the class of hidden to both of these. Alright, so now we have a 3-column table, and if I reduce the size of the viewport, even on mobile devices on small screens, we'll have enough space to display all of our data. This is great, but we should still display our title and email addresses when we have enough space. We can do this gradually at different breakpoints, and I think I want to bring the title first, so here on the TD, which is set to hidden by default, I think at the small breakpoint, we can switch back the display property to its default, which inside the table would be table cell. And for the email address, we'll do the same, but this time at the large breakpoint. And once again, I need to do the same with the table headings. For the title, we will at the small breakpoint set display to table cell, and I'll copy that. And for the email address, I will paste that and change the breakpoint to large. And by default, we only see the name, role, and edit button. And when I start increasing the width, as I hit the small breakpoint, the title column will appear and everything fits nicely. And as I keep increasing the width, eventually we'll hit the large breakpoint, and here the email address column will come back in our table. Alright, this is nice. We're displaying a different subset of information depending on the space available for our table. So that works, but what if everything is important and we cannot hide any information on smaller screens like we're doing now? Let's take a look at what other options we have in that scenario. What I'm thinking here, instead of just hiding the email and title columns, is to do some data grouping and perhaps display this information under the username here when they disappear from their own columns. So perhaps when we reach this breakpoint and the email is gone, we could have Jane Cooper and then the email address under here. And further, when the title disappears as well, we could have 3 bits of information here: Jane Cooper, email address, and title. And I kind of want to retain the title and email headings inside the table cell here. We're not going to actually display these headings, but at least in terms of semantics for screen readers, I'd like this information to be present. And so I'm going to use the description list element to achieve that. This is the table cell where we display the person's name, and under that I have a description list element, which will allow me to bring back the intent of the headings, so the term here will be title, and for our description details, we will show person.title. And I'll have a second key value pair, email, person.email. Like I mentioned, we actually do not want to display title and email here, but we want this to be present in the markup semantics. And so for both of these, I will add a class of SR only, so there's still valuable information for our screen readers, but they won't show up in our design. Alright, this is a good start, but now if I make the screen wider, you can see that when the title and email fields come back, we're still showing this information which is now redundant. So we want to show the title here only until it shows up in its own column, and the same with the email. I want to hide the email from here when it shows up in its own table column. The large breakpoint is where all of our table columns are showing, so I can probably hide the entire description list at that breakpoint. So now we're just displaying the title here. And once we go below the large breakpoint, we have a description list. But here we only want to show the email address because the title column is still in our table. So for the title term here, I will hide it at the small breakpoint, and I'll do the same with the details. By default, we show the title and email address, which do not show in their own table columns. When we reach the small breakpoint and the title column appears, we only show the email address, which is correct. And we're going to hide this email address as soon as it appears in its own columns here. Beautiful. So we're displaying the right data at the right time. Now let's go and style it a little bit better. First, I want to reduce the font weight on this secondary information so that our name stands out. In our TD element, we have a font medium class applied, which is a weight of 500. And for my description list here, I want to reduce that to 400 with font normal. Alright, and I also changed the text color slightly. Our title will have a color of text gray 700, and for the email, I'll make the color text gray 500. Alright, good. Next, I'll add a bit of spacing between each element to create some separation. I'll add a margin top of 1 for our title, and I'll do the same for the email. Alright, this is looking pretty good. And I think that when the email becomes the second line right after the name, we can make the text a little bit darker here. So it's at text gray 500, and at the small breakpoint, which is when the title disappears, we'll change that to text gray 700. Yeah, that's great. All right, so I'm really happy with this. I think this looks great at any screen sizes. Perhaps one thing that we can do on the small screens, since the majority of the table info sits in that column, is to make that column use as much space as possible and push the roll and edit button a little bit more to the right. So that's pretty easy. On the TD element for our person name, I can add a class of width full, W full, and that has pushed the other columns to the side, which is great, but we don't necessarily want this to be the case at larger screens. We really only ever want to have this width full class applied just for the smallest breakpoint and stop this behavior as soon as the title column comes back. So we've applied width full, and at the small breakpoint, I will reset that with width auto. I think everything looks wonderful now, but we could easily have some data wreck our layout. Let me show you what I mean. In our users data here, I'll change the email address for our last user and make it very long domain example.com. And whoops, our edit button is now hidden behind the viewport. The problem is the email address here is pushing the other columns to the right. We do not want to allow the content to increase the width of this table cell to the point where it hides other table columns. In the table cell that displays the person's name, I'm going to add a max width class of max width 0. And that's a nice trick to allow the width of the table cell to be smaller than the content that it contains. And so now the entire table is displaying very nicely, but we have an obvious new problem. We have this content overlap here, since our table cell width is narrower than its content. And what I can do here is use the truncate class on the email address, which is going to sort this really nicely. So on the email, I will add truncate. And you can see that the email address is now being truncated to fit perfectly within the available space, which is great. All right, let me bring back the email address to what it was in the user data. Okay, with our last maxWidth0 class, we've created a new little problem. So remember how we were applying a width full to the name cell here, and we only were doing this until the small breakpoint. Now that I have added max width of 0 to this table cell as well, watch what happens when I reach the small breakpoint. We once again allowing the table cell's width to be smaller than the actual content inside of it, and we probably don't want this. So we're going to unset this max width 0, and at the small breakpoint, I'll undo that with max width none. And now everything works properly once again. The strategy of what you show, what you hide, really depends on the sort of data that you have to display in your table. So you need to think of what fields you'd hide at what screen sizes, and also consider safeguarding your design by applying text truncation to your content wherever it's applicable. Matter of fact, to be safe here, I'll also truncate the name field as well as the title field, so that no matter how narrow the viewport becomes, we'll always have text truncation to make sure our layout doesn't break. That approach of grouping content can take you really far already, but if it's not working for you and you feel like you're really trying to fight for available space, remember that it's also totally okay to opt out of displaying a table for smaller screens and use a completely different layout instead. Sometimes duplicating or swapping out a block of HTML makes a lot more sense than trying to do some advanced responsive gymnastics to preserve the same markup. For this last example, I want to completely hide this table by default and bring it back, say, at the medium breakpoint. So right at the top of the component where we have this flex wrapper, we will change that to display hidden and then set it back to flex at the medium breakpoint. So now our table is showing after the medium breakpoint, but when I go below that breakpoint, the table will be hidden. We're going to display a completely different block of HTML that will present the same user data in a different layout. We won't build this layout together in this video. Instead, I'll paste some markup in my component file. I'll scroll right to the bottom of the component, and after our table, which is now hidden up to the medium breakpoint, I'll paste the markup for an alternative layout. Our cart view is a completely different block of HTML, but it iterates over and displays the same user data. Here's what it looks like. Instead of a table, we have an individual card for each person. We show the table above the medium breakpoint, and below that, we show the card layout instead. Those are two completely different DOM nodes, but again, there's nothing wrong with that approach. Quite often, it's going to be much easier to use that technique, have completely separate blocks of HTML for different breakpoints, rather than trying to wrangle with CSS to change the positioning of things in your layout. Alright, let's quickly recap the steps that we took to gradually improve the way we display our data in smaller screens. Our first easy fix was to add the overflow xAuto class to the table wrapper, so that our table content can scroll horizontally without completely breaking the page layout. Next, we started progressively hiding and revealing table columns, and decided to show only the most impactful data instead of making the content scroll horizontally. We then looked at grouping some data together instead of just hiding it. And we avoided content overlapping by applying the truncate class on our name, title, and email strings. Finally, we looked at a different approach where we completely hide the table up to the medium breakpoint and instead use a card layout, which is completely different HTML, but iterates on and displays the exact same user data. And that about wraps it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and now go make these tables of yours responsive. Bye for now.